A bankrupt millionaire loses a $3 billion company and panics until a poor 6-year-old girl does something that brings tears to his eyes and changes his life. For sharing this emotional story of despair and loneliness, tell us where you see us and subscribe for more powerful stories. The crystal champagne glass shattered against the marble floor of the boardroom on the 52nd floor, scattering fragments across the polished surface like fallen stars. Richard Hamilton stood motionless, his trembling hands still outstretched, hesitating to pick up what had been a toast to the success of his empire. The words of his lawyer echoed in his mind like a death sentence. Richard Apex Industries is gone. $7.3 billion evaporated. How? Richard's voice broke, barely a whisper in the room that had witnessed his greatest triumphs. His reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows showed a man who had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. The city stretched out below, 40 million people going about their lives, unaware that one of Manhattan's most powerful titans had just fallen from grace. Lawyer Michael Chen leafed through the documents with grim efficiency, his usually calm demeanor cracked by the weight of delivering such devastating news. The acquisition contracts you signed last month contained hidden clauses in subsections. Your partners, Stevens, Martinez, and Crawford, have legally transferred all assets to a subsidiary company that they control. Technically, everything is legal, Richard. You unwittingly signed away your life's work. Richard's legs gave way, and he slumped into his leather chair, the same one from which he had made multi-billion-dollar decisions that shaped entire industries, where he had built an empire out of determination and the last wish of his dying father. Now he was nothing more than a piece of furniture in a room that no longer belonged to him. The irony did not escape him. That chair had cost more than many people earned in a year, and now it could be the last expensive thing he ever sat on. My father built this company 60 years with a single construction contract, whispered the voice, broken completely. I've dedicated my life to expanding it, to honoring his memory. How could I have been so blind? The weight of generational failure crushed him like a physical force. His father had survived the Great Depression. He had created something lasting out of nothing, and Richard had destroyed it all in one afternoon of misplaced confidence. The phone vibrated incessantly on his desk. Journalists who had already found out, investors demanding explanations, employees who didn't yet know that their chow and retirement funds had disappeared overnight. Richard couldn't face any of them. Maybe he had never become what his father had always warned him about, a man so focused on growth that he forgot to protect what really mattered. Michael gathered his papers with the skill of someone who has delivered bad news before. Richard, I need you to understand the full scope of this. Your penthouse is mortgaged against company assets, your cars, your yachts, your vacation homes in the Hamptons and Aspen. Everything is tied to Apex Industries. Even your personal accounts are frozen until the transfer of assets is complete. In one afternoon, you've gone from multimillionaire to homeless. Richard finished with the bitter taste of the word in his mouth. Say it, Michael, I'm homeless. As the evening shadows covered the boardroom, tinging everything in shades of gray like his mood, he realized he had nowhere to go when they escorted him out. He had no family to call. His parents were dead. He never married. He was too consumed by business to build personal relationships. He had no real friends outside the corporate world, and those turned out to be wolves in expensive suits. The soft knock of the security guard on the door came just as closing time arrived. Richard stood up slowly, his body feeling decades older than his 45 years. He walked toward the elevator that would take him away from everything he knew. Tomorrow would be the anniversary of his father's death, and he couldn't help but think that the old man was surely turning in his grave, watching his son lose everything he had worked for. The morning rain felt different when there was no warm place to go. Richard adjusted his once expensive Armani coat as he crossed Portincon Park. Portincon Park. His Italian leather shoes splashed in puddles that yesterday he would have avoided without thinking. The irony was obvious. He had donated millions to homeless shelters, attending charity galas where the rich congratulated themselves on their generosity, never imagining that one day he would need those same shelters. His stomach growled painfully, a sensation so strange that he almost didn't recognize it. When was the last time he had felt hungry? At corporate lunches in the best restaurants in Manhattan, he barely tasted the avocado, too busy negotiating mergers and acquisitions worth more than the GDP of many countries. Now, the aroma of a nearby food cart made his mouth water, but his wallet contained only a few crumpled bills, change that in his former life wouldn't even buy him a decent cup of coffee. The park bench was harder than it looked and colder. Richard sat down to watch the world go by. Joggers in expensive sportswear, dog walkers with breeds worth more than cars, nannies pushing strollers probably more expensive than his current net worth. He had never noticed how many homeless people lived in that park, despite having passed by there hundreds of times on his way to important meetings. They were invisible to him, part of the urban landscape he had learned to ignore. "Excuse me, sir," a small voice interrupted his thoughts, piercing the fog of self-pity that surrounded him. Richard looked down and saw a girl of about 6 with tangled brown hair that glistened in a way that suggested it would be beautiful if well cared for. Her clothes had seen better days. A faded pink sweater with a small hole in the elbow, oversized jeans rolled up at the cuffs, sneakers that were once white. Despite her appearance, her eyes shone with an intelligence far beyond her years, bright green eyes that seemed to make everything. "It's okay. You look very sad," she said with the candidness that only children have, unfiltered by adult social conventions about not talking to strangers or avoiding uncomfortable topics. Richard tried to compose himself by straightening his shoulders in an automatic reaction instilled by decades of corporate meetings where showing weakness could cost millions. "I'm fine, sweetie. You shouldn't be at school." He glanced around for parents or guardians who might be wondering where this girl had come from. The girl shook her head at him, watching him with a disturbing insight that made Richard feel like he was being analyzed by someone much older and wiser than his apparent age. "Today is Saturday, sir, and you're not well. I don't know why you keep touching your stomach like my mom did when we didn't have money for food, and your eyes are red like you've been crying." She pulled out of a crumpled paper bag half a sandwich wrapped in a napkin. "Here, peanut butter and jelly. It's not fancy, but it helps when your stomach hurts from being empty." Richard looked at the offering, his throat tightening with an emotion he couldn't control. This girl who clearly had so little was trying to feed him. The sandwich looked homemade but simple, the kind of basic food that represented survival more than choice. "No, I can't accept your food. You need it more than I do. My name is Emma." "Ah," she said, completely ignoring his protest and pressing the sandwich into his hands with the firmness of someone accustomed to making executive decisions despite her age. "And you, Richard," he managed to say, his voice heavy with emotion that threatened to overwhelm him completely. Emma nodded seriously as if filing that information away for future reference. "Nice to meet you, Richard. My grandmother always said that sharing food makes it taste better and makes the person you share it with feel better too. She was very wise in those things." She paused, examining her expensive clothes, now wrinkled, with the analytical eye of someone who has learned to read situations quickly. "You weren't always poor, were you?" The question hit him like a physical blow, not because it was rude, but because it was so accurate. That 6-year-old girl had seen through his facade in seconds, reading the truth in details that he himself hadn't noticed. "How did you know that?" Emma smiled, revealing a gap where her front tooth should have been, which made her look even younger and more vulnerable. "Your hands are too soft to have been poor for very long. They don't have the calluses that come from working hard or washing clothes in sinks. And your coat is very good quality, even though it's dirty. Besides, the stitching is different from cheap clothes. My grandmother taught me to notice those things. And you stand up straight like my teacher says rich people do on TV. Even when you're sad," she shrugged, as if his observation were completely normal, as if anyone could read people like open books. "What happened to your money?" Richard found himself sitting on the park bench with Emma, sharing not only his sandwich, but also his story. There was something about the direct, unprejudiced questions of this girl that made him want to answer honestly, to unburden himself to someone who had no agenda, no corporate connections, no reason to use his information against him. She listened with the intensity of someone much older, nodding occasionally or asking surprisingly insightful questions that went straight to the heart of complex business issues. "So, those men who were your friends," Emma said, swinging her legs from the bench with the carefree attitude that only children have, "they tricked you into signing papers that gave them your entire company. All of it. That's actually a very accurate summary, admitted Richard, amazed at how she had distilled his legal nightmare into such simple terms. Three Harvard-educated lawyers had spent hours explaining the complexities of corporate law and asset transfers to him. But Emma had understood the essential betrayal in minutes. Emma frowned, her small face wrinkling in concentration that made her look like a tiny professor solving a difficult theorem. That sounds like the story of the fox and the crow my grandmother used to tell me. The fox tricks the crow into dropping his cheese by making him sing, telling him how beautiful his song is. The crow gets so pleased with the flattery that he opens his mouth and loses his food. She looked at him with eyes that seemed too old for her face. They made him feel special before he signed the papers. Richard's breath stopped. The memory came back with a vengeance. Stevenson's patting him on the back at the country club. Martinez praising his vision at the quarterly board meeting. Crawford calling him a genius at the charity gala just weeks before the signing. Yes, they praised me for my leadership. They said I was the only one who could lead the expansion they were proposing. They made me feel like I was finally getting the recognition I deserved after years of building the company. He looked at her in amazement. How do you see these things so clearly? Grandma says, I see patterns where others see veins. Emma replied casually, as if talking about the weather. She says, my brain works differently, like a puzzle that puts itself together, even when pieces are missing. Once she took me to a doctor who used long words like exceptional cognitive processing and pattern recognition abilities. But Grandma just said I was special, and that was enough for me. She pulled a worn notebook out of her pocket, its pages filled with childish writing and surprisingly sophisticated drawings. Sometimes I draw the patterns when I see them in my head. You want to see. Richard watched with growing amazement as Emma flipped through pages filled with incredibly detailed drawings and numbers. There were mathematical sequences he recognized from his engineering degree at EMIT, but organized in ways he had never seen before. Market trend charts that looked remarkably like stock patterns he had studied. Organizational charts that resembled the corporate structures he had learned about at Harvard Business School. Flowcharts showing cause and effect relationships that would have impressed his own strategic consultants. Emma, Richard said slowly. His voice was filled with amazement and growing enthusiasm. Where did you learn to draw like that? These concepts are graduate-level business and math. I just see them in my head. He replied as if everyone could visualize complex systems and relationships, like when I see your problem. I can see the shape it's in. The papers you signed probably had a lot of big words to hide the important parts. Only important parts, right? That's also a pattern. People hide important things in boring places because they know others won't look there. Richard felt his heart race as he understood what he was seeing. What happened to your parents? Where do you live? The question came out more urgent than he meant it took to me to, but he needed to know more about this extraordinary girl. Emma's expression turned sad, shadows crossing her young face like clouds covering the sun. My grandmother died 6 months ago. She took care of me because my parents died in a car accident when I was little. I don't remember them very well. Grandma said they were also very smart, that I got my brain from them. Lit up a little with the resilience that only children have. But I'm okay. I'm good at figuring things out. And there are good people like Mrs. Rodriguez at the library who help me sometimes. The revelation hit Richard like a bolt of lightning. This bright little girl was practically homeless, surviving thanks to her extraordinary mind and the kindness of strangers, moving through a world she probably didn't know how to navigate with her abilities. Meanwhile, he was there with problems that seemed impossible to him, and she was already seeing solutions that he couldn't even imagine. Emma, he said carefully, his mind racing with possibilities he couldn't yet articulate. Do you want me to help you with something? It might be complicated, but I think you might see things I don't see, things that could be very important. Seriously, like a puzzle, a big one. Exactly, like a puzzle, a very big and very important one that could change our lives. Richard took out his phone, which still working, even though everything else had collapsed. His exes hadn't thought to cut off his service, probably believing he was too devastated to fight back. I have copies of all the contracts I signed, digital files that my lawyer sent me before everything happened. Would you be willing to look at them? Can we go somewhere warm? Emma asked practically. My fingers work better when they're not cold, and this kind of puzzle requires good concentration. Richard looked around the park, realizing he had no idea where they could go. His cards were frozen, his office closed and probably already emptied by his exes, his apartment sealed by the bank. Everything he once considered his was now off limits. No, I don't really know where we could go. Emma stood up, brushing the crumbs off her worn jeans with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making do with what she has. I know a place. The library is warm and they have computers that work really well. Mrs. Rodriguez, who works there, is nice to me. She lets me use the internet to study and never asks many questions about where my parents are. She looked at him with a concern too mature for her age. You really don't have anywhere to go, do you? The contrast of their situations hit him hard. A 6-year-old girl with no home offering him shelter and resources. Taking charge with the confidence of someone who learned early on that survival means being resourceful. He didn't admit the word out loud, carrying all the weight of his fall from grace. I don't have it. Emma took his hand with the confidence of someone used to leading in difficult situations. Her small fingers were surprisingly firm and warm. It's okay. We'll figure it out together. That's what Grandma always said. Problems get smaller when you share them with the right person, and they disappear completely when you share them with someone who sees things differently than you. As they walked toward the library, Richard found himself studying Emma more closely. Her observations about people and patterns were not mere tricks. They demonstrated a level of analytical thinking that most adults never developed, even with years of expensive education. The way she immediately understood the core of his business problem and boiled it down to its essentials and started thinking about solutions was extraordinary. But even more so, there was something about her way of thinking that reminded him of his father. A practical intelligence that cut through complexity to find simple truths. Emma, he said as he reached the steps of the library, the imposing stone building that now looked like a sanctuary. Have you ever been tested for intelligence? I mean officially. Emma shrugged, a gesture that conveyed both indifference and disappointment. Grandma said that schools wouldn't know what to do with me anyway. She tried to get me into some special programs, but they wanted too much paperwork and asked a lot of questions about insurance and permanent addresses. She taught me almost everything at home: reading, writing, numbers, history. He paused, looking at the library with obvious affection. But I learned other things too, just by watching and listening, like how people's voices change when they lie, or how numbers on business documents almost always tell a different story than the words say. Richard paused, looking at her with growing amazement. Really? What do you mean numbers tell different stories? Well, Emma said, sitting down on the stairs as if preparing to give a lecture. When adults want to hide something in business documents, they put the ugly numbers in very small print and in weird places. But they have to put them somewhere because of the rules, right? So if you ignore all the big words and just follow the numbers like it's a treasure map, you can usually see what's really going on. Richard felt his pulse quicken with the first real hope since the previous day's disaster. Have you ever done that? Followed the numbers on business papers? Yes, Emma nodded enthusiastically, lighting up completely as she shared something she was passionate about. Sometimes I find newspapers in the trash and they have business sections with lots of numbers and company reports. I like looking at the patterns in the stock numbers and in the reports. They're like stories, but told with math instead of words. Math never lies, even when words try to. Inside the warmth of the library, Emma led Richard to a quiet corner with public computers. She moved around the place with the familiarity of someone who had spent countless hours there. The building felt like a sanctuary. High ceilings, warm lighting, the comforting smell of books and knowledge. Mrs. Rodriguez, a librarian with a kind face, about 50 years old, gray hair and gentle eyes, greeted Emma with obvious affection. Hello, dear. I was wondering when you would come today, she said with the warmth of genuine care. Then she noticed Richard, and her expression changed to polite curiosity mixed with protective concern. And who's your friend? This is Richard, Emma said with the direct honesty that characterized all her interactions. He's helping me with a big puzzle about business documents. It's very complicated. Mrs. Rodriguez smiled warmly at Richard, although in her eyes there were the subtle questions of someone who has learned to be cautious with adults who befriend children without a clear connection. Any friend of Emma's is welcome here. She's one of our most dedicated researchers, isn't she, dear? She reads everything: business magazines, science magazines, history books. I've never seen a girl so curious about the world. As Emma logged onto the computer with obvious ease, her little fingers flew over the keyboard with surprising speed and confidence. Richard marveled at how this girl had created a support network for herself. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving, using every resource at her disposal to continue learning and growing, despite circumstances that would have broken many adults. "All right, Richard," Emma said, patting the chair next to her with the authority of someone running an important project. "Show me those contracts. I want to see what tricks they're using to steal your company." Richard opened his email and searched for the files his lawyer had sent him. The contracts filled the screen, dozens of pages of dense legal language, corporate structures, financial terms, and subheadings that would have challenged even experienced lawyers. Emma leaned forward, her little fingers tracing patterns on the screen as she read, her eyes moving in complex trajectories that suggested she was processing information at a speed that seemed impossible. Emma leaned forward, her little fingers tracing patterns on the screen as she read, her eyes moving in complex trajectories that suggested she was processing information at a speed that seemed impossible. What happened next challenged everything Richard thought he knew about human capacity. Emma began to read at a speed impossible for anyone, let alone a 6-year-old girl. Her eyes darted across the screen in intricate patterns. She wasn't just reading the words, she was processing, analyzing, and cross-referencing information in real time, her mind working like a computer designed for pattern recognition and analysis. "This is weird," Emma said after less than 10 minutes, with the certainty of someone who has found something important. "These papers are lying, and not just a little. They're lying in a very clever way." "What do you mean?" Richard asked, leaning toward her, his heart racing with anticipation. Emma pointed to a section buried deep in the contract, her finger moving with the precision of someone who knows exactly what they're looking for. "See these numbers? They say that the new company, Hamilton Stevens Holdings, owns 51% of your old company, Apex Industries. That makes it look like you still have some control, right? But look at this part here." She moved to another section with the confidence of someone who had already mapped out the entire document in her mind. "It says here that your friend's company, Stevens, Martinez, and Crawford, LLC, owns 100% of Hamilton Stevens Holdings. And this part says that Hamilton Stevens Holdings owns everything that used to be yours." Richard narrowed his eyes, following Emma's logic as she traced the complex web of corporate ownership. The legal language that had seemed simple when her lawyers explained it to her now revealed something much more sinister. "I think I understand what you're saying, but the lawyer said this was a standard partnership structure." "It's like a shell game," Emma interrupted, her enthusiasm growing as she saw the pattern clearly. "You know, when they hide a ball under a cup and move it around so you don't know where it is, they made it look like you were joining them as an equal partner. But they were actually taking everything and hiding it under different names, so you couldn't see what was going on." Emma's fingers flew across the keyboard, opening several documents at once with the multitasking ability of someone whose mind was operating on several levels at once. "Look, Richard, every contract you signed follows the same pattern. They made you believe you were expanding your business into new areas, but every document actually moved a part of your company under their control. The construction division went to Hamilton Stevens Construction. The real estate went to Hamilton Stevens Properties. Even your father's original patents ended up at Hamilton Stevens Technologies." Richard felt his chest tighten as he realized the magnitude of the betrayal. These weren't just partners who had become greedy. They were professional thieves who had planned this systematically, probably for months. They planned this for a long time, didn't they? Maybe even years. Emma said her face was serious under the weight of what she was discovering. "But here's the important thing, Richard. They made a mistake, a very big one." She opened another document, her eyes scanning it with the intensity of someone who has found a crucial piece of evidence. "Look at the dates on these signatures." His little finger traced the screen, pointing to dates Richard had never paid attention to before. details buried in the avalanche of paperwork during the signing process. Look at this contract for the transfer of the construction division. You signed it on March 15th at 2:47 p.m. I see the time on the digital signature, but look at the date of registration with the Secretary of State, March 12th at 9:23 a.m. in CCM. Richard leaned closer, his heart racing as he saw the implications. That's 3 days before I signed it. How is that possible? Exactly. Emma's eyes sparkled with the excitement of the discovery. Her enthusiasm was contagious despite the gravity of the matter. And this one is for real estate properties, and this one is for technology patents. They also submitted all these papers to the government before you signed them. That means they were so sure you would sign that they sent the documentation in advance. But that's fraud, isn't it? You can't transfer ownership of something with signatures that don't exist yet. Richard's mind was spinning as he grasped the full scope of the deception. Emma, if those dates are correct, it means the contracts were fraudulent from the start. They couldn't legally transfer the assets based on signatures that didn't exist yet. He looked at this extraordinary girl who had just given him the key to getting his life back. How did you see that? I've had 3 of the best corporate lawyers in Manhattan reviewing these documents for weeks. Adults tend to focus on the big and important parts. The amounts of money, the names of the companies, the fancy legal words. Kids look at everything because we don't know what's supposed to be important. Plus, I always check the dates on everything because Grandma taught me that time tells you more about people's true intentions than their words. Emma continued reviewing more documents, her small hands moving with the precision of someone who has found a clear trail to follow. Besides, there's something else weird that they probably didn't think anyone would find. She opened a new document that Richard had never seen before, buried deep in the digital archives. This was attached to one of your contracts, but it was hidden in the file code metadata. I found it by accident when I was checking the file properties. Where did you learn to look at the metadata of a file? Richard asked, amazed by the girl's technical sophistication. At YouTube University, Emma said with a smile, using an expression that made her sound much older. There are tutorials for everything, and you know how to search. Grandma said that learning was the most important thing I could do, so I try to learn something new every day. Computer stuff is really interesting because it's all patterns and logic. The document Emma had found was a chain of emails between Stevens, Martinez, and Crawford, discussing their plans in detail. Richard read them with growing anger and amazement, seeing his supposed friends refer to him as the target and talk about how they would eliminate the problem Hamilton forever once the transfers were complete. These men aren't really your friends, are they? Emma asked in a low voice, reading the emotions on his face with the perceptiveness that characterized her. Richard felt tears welling up in his eyes, not with sadness this time, but with gratitude and amazement at what this extraordinary girl had accomplished in less than an hour. Emma, you just saved my company. You uncovered a fraud that 3 law firms overlooked. You've given me evidence that could send these men to prison and give me back everything my father built. But even as he said it, Richard realized that Emma had given him something far more valuable than legal ammunition. She had shown him the value of seeing problems in a different way, the power of spotting patterns that others overlooked, and the wisdom that could come from the most unexpected sources. Emma smiled. Her dimpled smile lit up her face with the boast of having used her gifts for something important. That's what friends are for, isn't it? To help each other solve puzzles? She paused. Oh, and she added with a wisdom surprising for someone her age. Besides, I think we both needed to be saved. You needed someone to see the truth that was right in front of your eyes, and I needed someone who believed that I could help with adult problems. Richard knew she was right. In trying to help each other, they had both found what they needed most. But more than that, Emma had given him back something he had lost on his path to success: the ability to see clearly, to trust his instincts, and to recognize that sometimes the most powerful solutions come from the most unlikely sources. Emma, Richard said, his voice heavy with emotion and determination, will you help me get my company back? Really help me. It'll be complicated and probably dangerous, but with your mind and my business knowledge, I think we could do something incredible. Are you serious? You really want my help with something this important? I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Richard replied, and he meant it. The next morning, Richard and Emma sat in a small restaurant near the library, sharing a breakfast that cost less than what Richard usually spent on a cup of coffee. But that modest meal tasted like a feast because it was accompanied by hope, something he hadn't felt in days. Emma had spent the night in a youth hostel while Richard had found refuge in a 24-hour laundromat, but they had agreed to meet early to plan their counterattack. "We need a lawyer," Richard said, stirring his coffee distractedly. "Someone who specializes in corporate fraud, someone with the resources to take on Stevens, Martinez, and Crawford. But all the good lawyers in town either work for them or owe them favors." Emma looked up from her pancakes with syrup on her chin and determination in her eyes. "What if we look for someone who doesn't owe them anything? Someone they wouldn't think of buying off. Like who?" Most lawyers capable of handling such a big case are already connected in some way to the corporate world. Emma took out her worn notebook and opened it to a page filled with her characteristic drawings and notes. "I've been thinking again about the patterns. Your friends stole your company by hiding things in plain sight, right? So maybe we should fight back the same way, finding help in places where they wouldn't think to look." Richard leaned forward, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "Well," Emma said in that analytical tone that was already familiar to him, "yesterday when I was researching cases of corporate fraud on the library computers, I came across a story about a lawyer named Sarah Chen. She's only been practicing for 5 years, but she's won 3 major cases against large corporations. The article said she grew up poor and became a lawyer to help people who are cheated by rich companies." Richard felt a spark of interest. "Archon, NSK, any connection to my lawyer, Michael Chen?" Emma's eyes widened. "That would be a very interesting coincidence, don't you think? Maybe she knows how the system works from the inside." He turned the page. "According to the internet, she works at a small firm that takes cases other lawyers won't touch. And best of all, she's never lost a case involving fraudulent contracts." That's brilliant. Even if my ex-colleagues know about her, they would never see her as a real threat because she doesn't have the resources of a large firm." Richard felt his pulse quicken at the first real strategic thought since he lost everything. "But how do we pay her? I've got like $50 left." Emma smiled with the confidence of someone who had already solved that problem. "That's the good part. According to her firm's website, they work on a contingency fee basis in fraud cases. That means they only get paid if we win. And with the evidence I found in those contracts, we have a very strong case." Richard looked at her in awe for the umpteenth time, amazed by her ability to see solutions where he saw only obstacles. "You researched all this last night." "I couldn't sleep," Emma admitted. "My brain gets too excited when I'm working on a big puzzle. So I went back to the library after they turned off the lights at the shelter and used the computers. Mrs. Rodriguez gave me special permission because she knows I'm careful. The idea that a 6-year-old girl had spent the night researching legal strategies while he was drowning in self-pity made him feel humble and inspired. Emma, you're absolutely right. Sarah Chen could be just what we need, but there's something we need to consider. Once we start this fight, Stevens and his associates will find out what we found. Could you come get us?" Emma's expression turned serious, but not scared. "Grandma always said that standing up to bullies is scary, but letting them win is worse. Besides," she added with a little smile, "they probably think you're too broken to fight back, and they surely don't know anything about me. That gives us an advantage." For the first time since his world had fallen apart, Richard found himself smiling. The courage and strategic vision of this girl were extraordinary. But more than that, she was giving him back something he had lost, the belief that fighting was possible. "Okay," Richard said, pulling out his phone. "Let's call Sarah Chen and see if she wants to take on 3 of the most powerful corporate lawyers in Manhattan." Emma clapped excitedly. "This is going to be so interesting. I've never seen a real legal battle." As Richard dialed, he realized that Emma was about to witness much more than a legal battle. She was going to help orchestrate one of the most significant corporate fraud cases in recent history. The phone rang twice before a firm professional voice answered. "Chen and Associates, Sarah Chen speaking." "Ms. Chen," Richard began, his voice firm thanks to his newfound determination. "My name is Richard Hamilton, and I believe I have evidence of corporate fraud that could be of great interest to you." My name is Richard Hamilton, and I believe I have evidence of corporate fraud that may be of great interest to you. There was a pause. Richard Hamilton from Apex Industries. I heard what happened. I'm listening. Sarah Chen's office was on the third floor of a converted brownstone in Brooklyn, far from the gleaming towers of Manhattan, where Richard had been doing business for decades. But as soon as he and Emma walked in, he knew they had found the right person. The walls were covered with framed articles about her victories against corporate giants, and her desk was organized with the precision of someone who left nothing to chance. Sarah was younger than Richard, probably in her early 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses and the confident bearing of someone who has learned to fight against adversaries bigger than herself. She greeted them with professional warmth, although Richard caught a surprised glance toward Emma. Mr. Hamilton, I must admit, I'm curious about what you've discovered. When I heard about the situation at Apex Industries, everything seemed unusually clean for such a large asset transfer. He motioned for them to take a seat across from his desk. And this must be your daughter. Actually, Emma said before Richard could respond, I'm her partner. I was the one who found the evidence. Sarah's eyebrows arched, but she didn't lose her composure. I see. Well, partner, why don't you show me what you found? Over the next hour, Emma guided Sarah through the fraudulent contracts with the same methodical precision she had shown Richard. Sarah's expression grew more intense with each revelation, and Richard could see the lawyer's mind working out legal strategies. This is extraordinary, he said finally, leaning back in his chair. The backdated submissions alone constitute several serious crimes. Add in the hidden communications about eliminating the Hamilton problem, and we're also talking about conspiracy charges. He looked directly at Emma. How old are you, sweetheart? 6, Emma replied simply. But my grandmother always said, age doesn't matter when you're looking for the truth. Sarah was silent for a moment, clearly processing what it meant to have a 6-year-old girl as a key witness in a major fraud case. Emma, what you found here could not only give Mr. Hamilton his company back, but also send some very powerful people to prison. Are you ready for what that could mean? You mean they could try to hurt us or make us look bad? It's possible. These men have billions at stake and a reputation to protect. They will use every resource to discredit this evidence and anyone connected to it. Richard felt a protective instinct run through him. Sarah, Emma is just a child. If there's any danger, I can handle it myself, Emma interrupted him firmly. Besides, they already took everything from you. Richard, what else can they do? And they have nothing to take from me except my brain, and they can't steal that. Sarah smiled at his logic. You're right, but there are other ways to attack someone's credibility. They could say that a child can't understand such complex documents, or that an adult trained you to say certain things. Emma took a small digital recorder out of her backpack. That's why I recorded myself explaining everything I found, with timestamps and everything. I also made copies of all my research notes in my own handwriting. My grandmother taught me that you always have to keep records when something is important. You recorded yourself analyzing the evidence 3 times, actually. Once when I found the problems, once when I explained it to Richard, and once last night when I went over everything again to make sure I hadn't missed anything. Emma placed the recorder on Sarah's desk. Grandma used to say, the best way to prove you understand something is to explain it clearly to someone else. Richard watched Sarah's expression change from surprise to admiration and then to something close to amazement. Emma, in 30 years of practicing law, I've never seen evidence so well documented by anyone, let alone a 6-year-old girl. I want to make sure we win, Emma said simply. Richard's father built something important, and these men stole it. That's not fair or right. Sarah silently reviewed Emma's notes and listened to parts of her recordings. Finally, she looked up with the expression of someone who has just realized that she is holding a winning lottery ticket in her hands. I'll take the case, she said, but I want to make something clear. This is not going to be easy or quick. Stevens, Martinez, and Crawford have unlimited resources and some of the best lawyers money can buy. They're going to fight dirty and try to destroy anyone who threatens them. I understand the risks, Richard said seriously. Really? Sarah asked incisively. Because once we file these fraud charges, there's no turning back. They'll come after you with everything they've got. Emma rose from her chair, her small figure towering over the serious adult conversation. Ms. Chen, sometimes the right thing is scary, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. My grandmother used to say that bullies count on good people being too afraid to stand up for themselves. Are we going to agree with her? Are we going to agree with her? Or are we going to show them that stealing is wrong no matter how much money you have? Sarah smiled, and Richard saw the moment when the lawyer realized that she wasn't just taking on a case, she was joining a crusade led by the most unlikely general. All right then, Sarah said, picking up her phone. Let's go to war. The federal court in Lower Manhattan had never seemed so intimidating to Richard as it did that Tuesday morning. 3 weeks later, Sarah had worked with unprecedented speed to file the fraud charges. But now came the hard part, proving her case before a judge who would decide whether Stevens, Martinez, and Crawford would face criminal charges and whether Richard could get his company back. She sat between Richard and Sarah at the plaintiff's table in a simple blue dress that Sarah had bought for her, looking surprisingly serene for a 6-year-old about to testify in federal court. Across the hall, Stevens, Martinez, and Crawford were accompanied by their army of lawyers. 12 in all, the best money could buy. All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Williams, he announced Alice Hill. Judge Williams was a stern-looking woman in her 60s with silver hair and the steady bearing of someone who had presided over complex cases for decades. As she sat down, her eyes met Emma's briefly, and Richard noticed a flash of curiosity in her expression. This is Emma. This is highly irregular, said James Morrison, lead counsel for the defendants, rising to his feet. Your Honor, the plaintiff is asking this court to believe that a 6-year-old girl discovered a sophisticated financial fraud that went undetected by several law firms and corporate auditors. We respectfully submit that this is either an elaborate hoax or evidence that she was trained by adults with their own interests at stake. Sarah stood to respond. Your Honor, we appreciate Mr. Morrison's skepticism. In fact, we are prepared to demonstrate not only that Emma Hamilton Chen discovered this fraud independently, but that her unique analytical skills allowed her to see patterns that a conventional legal review completely missed. Emma Hamilton Chen uncovered this fraud independently, but that her unique analytical skills allowed her to see patterns that a conventional legal review missed entirely. Richard noted that Sarah had given Emma a compound last name for the court proceedings, a legal strategy to establish her as part of the plaintiff's family unit while protecting her identity. Identity. Emma had chosen Chen herself, saying she wanted to honor both Sarah and her grandmother, who taught her to see the truth in patterns. Very well, said Judge Williams, but I want to make something clear to all parties. This court will not tolerate any attempt to exploit or manipulate a minor, no matter where that attempt comes from. Miss Chen, may you begin your presentation? Sarah approached the witness stand with confidence. Your Honor, we will begin with the most direct evidence. The previously filed documents establishing a clear timeline of fraud when he lit up a large screen showing the contracts alongside their registration dates with the government. As you can see, every major asset transfer was registered with the Secretary of State's office before Mr. Hamilton signed the corresponding contracts. This alone constitutes several serious crimes under federal fraud laws. Objection, Your Honor, Morrison quickly said, standing up. This could easily be an administrative error or flaws in the registration system. Granted, Judge Williams replied. Miss Chen, you must prove intent to defraud, not just discrepancies in paperwork, of course, Your Honor, Sarah replied with a slight smile. Emma, could you explain to the court how you discovered the pattern of deception in these contracts? My mama stood up, her small voice sounding clear over the courtroom's audio system. Your Honor, when I saw these papers, I realized that the adults were playing the cup game with Mr. Richards' company. Judge Williams leaned forward, interested. Can you explain what you mean by the cup game, Emma? It's when someone moves things around really fast so you don't know where they ended up, Emma said, approaching the screen with surprising calm. Mr. Richard thought he was partnering with these men, but in reality they were moving all the parts of his company into boxes they controlled. She pointed to the organizational chart she had drawn up. Look, it looked like Hamilton Stevens Holdings belonged to everyone, but in reality, Stevens Martinez Crawford LLC owned 100% of Hamilton Stevens Holdings, which in turn owned 100% of everything that used to belong to Mr. Richard. The room fell completely silent as Emma continued to dismantle complex corporate structures with astonishing clarity. Even Morrison's team leaned forward, impressed in spite of themselves. But more importantly, Emma continued, they were so sure that Mr. Richard would sign that they submitted the documents to the government before he actually signed them. That's not a mistake. That's cheating on purpose. Judge Williams took notes, looking increasingly serious. Emma, how can you be sure it wasn't just an administrative error? Emma smiled and took the hidden emails out of her folder because they had written to each other saying that they were going to eliminate the Hamilton problem forever. People don't write emails like that for administrative errors. The impact was immediate. Morrison jumped to his feet. Objection. Those emails are completely out of context. Denied, said the judge firmly. The witness may continue. Emma looked directly at the defense table, meeting the gaze of three men who had completely underestimated her. The pattern is very clear when you see all the pieces together. They planned it for a long time. They hid the important parts in boring places where they thought no one would look, and they made mistakes because they got greedy and careless. Richard felt proud as he watched this extraordinary girl dismantle a multi-million-dollar fraud with the clarity of someone who sees the truth without the filters of prejudice and self-interest typical of adults. The cross-examination was brutal. Morrison approached with the predatory confidence of someone accustomed to destroying witnesses, but clearly he had never ever faced anyone like her. His strategy was obvious. Confuse, intimidate, or make a 6-year-old girl contradict herself or break down in tears. Now, Emma, Morrison began with condescending sweetness. You're only 6 years old, right? That's right. You haven't studied business, law, or accounting. That's true, Emma replied cheerfully. But I can read, I can count, and I can see patterns. And that's all you need to know when someone is lying with numbers. Morrison's smile tightened. But surely you had help understanding these complex adult documents that explain their meaning to you. Nope, Emma said simply. I figured it out on my own, just like I solve puzzles and logic problems. In fact, it was easier than some of the riddles I do for fun. Come on, Emma. These are sophisticated corporate structures that even challenge experienced lawyers. You expect this court to believe that a little girl? Mr. Morrison, Emma interrupted politely. Why do you keep saying I'm just a little girl? As if that means I'm not intelligent. Some children are good at sports, others at music, and some of us are good at seeing patterns in numbers and contracts. It's not that unusual. Laughter spread through the courtroom, and Richard saw Judge Williams suppress a smile. Morrison was visibly uncomfortable with Emma's refusal to be intimidated. Let's try another approach, he said, hardening his tone. Emma, do you know what perjury means? Objection, Sarah jumped in immediately. The defense attorney was trying to intimidate a minor witness. Objection granted, Judge Williams said harshly. Mr. Morrison, you will treat this witness with the respect she deserves or I will hold you in contempt. But Emma seemed unfazed. Okay, Miss Sarah, I know what perjury means. It's when you lie in court, but I'm not lying and I can prove everything I said. Morrison latched onto that. Prove it. How can you prove your interpretation of these documents? Prove it. How can you prove your interpretation of these documents? Emma pulled a thick stack of papers from her folder filled with her distinctive handwriting and drawings. I wrote down everything I found when I found it and how I discovered it. I also made charts showing all the connections between the companies and recorded myself explaining it 3 different ways so there's no doubt about what I understood and when I understood it. She handed the papers to the bailiff, who took them to Judge Williams. As the judge reviewed the documentation, her eyebrows rose higher and higher. Mr. Morrison, she said after several minutes, have you reviewed the witness's document analysis? Morrison looked uncomfortable. Your Honor, we've seen some handwritten notes, but this isn't just notes, the judge interrupted him, holding up EMA's charts. This is a comprehensive forensic analysis of corporate fraud with a timeline, chain of custody for evidence, and detailed explanations of the methodology. I've seen less complete work from professional consultants. Emma smiled smugly. Thank you, Your Honor. My grandmother always said, if something is worth doing, it's worth doing right. Morrison made a last desperate attempt. Your Honor, even if we accept that this girl has unusual abilities, The fact is that she has no legal standing to accuse. In fact, Emma interjected, raising her hand as if she were in class, I am not accusing anyone of anything. I am just showing what the numbers, dates, and emails say. The accusations of fraud are being made by Miss Sarah and Mr. Richard. I only found the evidence that proves they are right. The distinction was brilliant, and Richard realized that Emma understood better than many adults the legal implications of her role. She wasn't claiming to be a legal expert, just presenting the facts and letting the adults draw their own conclusions. Morrison slumped back in his seat, realizing that his cross-examination had only made Emma more credible. Judge Williams looked at Emma, then at the evidence, and then at the defense table where Stevens, Martinez, and Crawford were looking pale. Miss Chen, the judge said, I believe we have heard enough testimony for today. I want to review all the evidence in my chambers before continuing. She turned to the defendants. Gentlemen, I strongly suggest that you use this recess to consider whether you wish to continue contesting these charges. When the session was adjourned, Richard saw Stevens approach his lawyers with the desperate urgency of someone who feels that his carefully constructed world is collapsing. Emma, meanwhile, calmly organized her papers with the satisfaction of someone who has just finished a difficult but enjoyable puzzle. How do you feel? Richard asked her quietly. Emma looked up with a smile too mature for her age. I feel fine. We told the truth, and the truth makes sense. That's the only thing you can really do, isn't it? Richard realized that in the midst of that legal battle, Emma had taught him something fundamental about courage. It's not the absence of fear, but the willingness to do the right thing, no matter the consequences. The settlement negotiations took place in Judge Williams's office with Emma sitting silently next to Sarah. While Richard tried to process what was happening, Stevens, Martinez, and Crawford had called an emergency meeting after thoroughly reviewing Emma's evidence, and their attitude had shifted from confident arrogance to poorly concealed panic. Your Honor, Morrison began in a much more diplomatic tone than before, my clients are willing to discuss a resolution that could benefit all parties. Judge Williams looked at him skeptically. Mr. Morrison, your clients are facing federal fraud charges that could result in decades in prison. What exactly do you propose? Stevens leaned forward, his face gaunt after 3 sleepless nights since Emma's testimony. We are willing to return full ownership of Apex Industries to Mr. Hamilton, along with compensation for the disruption of operations. Richard felt his heart race, but Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his arm. What kind of compensation are we talking about? She asked coldly. $200 million, Martinez said in a low voice, plus legal fees and a formal public apology. Emma tugged at Sarah's sleeve. May I say something? Judge Williams nodded. Of course, Emma. Emma stood up, her small figure towering over the room full of powerful adults. That's not enough, she said simply. Stevens looked at her incredulously. Excuse me, $200 million isn't enough? Emma repeated with confidence. No, it's not enough. Judge Williams nodded. Of course, Emma. Emma stood up, her small figure towering over the room full of powerful adults. That's not enough, she said simply. Stevens looked at her incredulously. Excuse me, $200 million isn't enough, Emma repeated with confidence. No, it's not enough, Judge Williams nodded. Of course, Emma. Emma stood up, her small figure towering over the room full of powerful adults. That's not enough, no, Emma repeated with the confidence of someone who had done her math. They stole a company worth $7.3 billion. They used it to make money for 3 weeks while Mr. Richard was homeless and hungry. They also hurt all the employees because they didn't know if they would keep their jobs. She took out her notebook. Everyone in the room recognized the weight of EMA's data. She opened a specific page. According to the financial reports I found on the internet, Apex Industries generated $47 million in the 3 weeks that you controlled it. In addition, they were probably planning to dismantle the company and sell it off in pieces, which would have destroyed what Mr. Richard's father built. Crawford shifted uncomfortably. Those calculations are very sophisticated for someone your age. Math is math, Emma replied with a shrug, but this is what I think is fair. You return the company in its entirety. You pay $500 million for the pain and damage you caused, and each of you spends time in prison to learn that stealing is wrong. The courtroom fell silent. Morrison looked as if he had been struck by lightning. Your Honor, surely you can't expect my clients to negotiate with a 6-year-old girl. Actually, Judge Williams said with what seemed like a hint of amusement, EMA's assessment seems quite reasonable given the scope of the fraud. Furthermore, you have raised an important point about the criminal consequences that cannot be removed through negotiation. Sarah leaned forward. Your Honor, would you be willing to recommend reduced sentences in exchange for full restitution, community service, and permanent bans from holding corporate management positions? Emma raised her hand again. In addition, they have to promise never to harm other people's businesses again, and they should take classes on why stealing is wrong. Stevens looked desperately at his lawyers. This is crazy. We are negotiating the terms of our surrender with a girl who outsmarted all of you, Judge Williams observed dryly, a girl who uncovered evidence they believed was well hidden, who documented her findings in more detail than most professional investigators, and who is now proposing a legally sound and ethically appropriate resolution. Richard spoke for the first time at the meeting. Emma is right about everything, but I want to add one more condition. He looked directly at Stevens, Martinez, and Crawford. You are going to fund a scholarship program for gifted children who don't have access to a proper education. Emma showed me that there are brilliant kids out there who just need someone to believe in them. Emma's eyes lit up. We could really help other kids who see patterns like I do. Exactly, Richard replied. The Emma Hamilton Foundation for Exceptional Young Minds. $1 million a year for the next 20 years. Stevens looked at his partners, then at Morrison, who was clearly calculating the alternatives to accepting those terms. Federal prison versus fines and community service. There really was no choice. We accept, Stevens said quietly. Judge Williams took notes in her legal notebook. Very well. I will expect formal agreements within 48 hours with detailed plans for the transfer of assets, restitution payments, and community service arrangements. She looked at Emma with something resembling admiration. Young lady, you just negotiated one of the most comprehensive corporate fraud settlements in the history of the federal court. Emma smiled, but then her expression became thoughtful. Your Honor, may I ask you something? Of course. What happens to me now? I really don't have anywhere to live, and I don't think I can go back to hiding in shelters and libraries. The question hung in the air, and Richard realized that in all the excitement of the legal victory, they hadn't addressed the most important thing. What would happen to the extraordinary girl who had saved his life in his company? Judge Williams looked from Emma to Richard and then to Sarah, her judicial mind weighing the complexities of the situation. That's an excellent question, Emma, and I think it deserves very careful consideration. 6 months later, Richard was in the renovated boardroom of Apex Industries, watching Emma explain her latest project to a group of astonished investors. The company was stronger than ever. The fraud settlement had provided resources to expand, and Emma's ideas had led to innovations that positioned Apex as a leader in sustainable construction technology. But the most important change was not in the business, but in the family that had been formed out of the most unlikely circumstances. The adoption process had been complex, requiring testimony from social workers, psychologists, and education specialists, all confirming what Richard already knew. Emma was an extraordinary child who needed an extraordinary environment to thrive. Judge Williams had personally supervised the process, ensuring that Emma's best interests were protected and allowing her to join the family she had chosen. The solar panel integration system reduces construction costs by 37% and improves energy efficiency by 52%. EMA explained to investors with a presentation she created herself. But the most exciting thing is how we can scale this technology so that low-income families can access better quality housing. Sarah, now general counsel at Apex Industries and EMA's legal guardian, along with Richard, watched from the back of the room with obvious pride. The adoption had created an unconventional family structure. Richard as father, Sarah as second mother, and Emma as the brilliant daughter who brought them all together. Rebecca Martinez, the child psychologist who evaluated Emma during the adoption, had explained to Richard that Emma's intelligence fell into a category that occurs perhaps once in a generation. Not only does she have a high IQ, the doctor said, she has a unique way of recognizing patterns that allows her to see connections that others don't perceive. Combined with emotional intelligence far beyond her age, She has the potential to change the world. The Emma Hamilton Foundation had already awarded scholarships to 43 gifted children from disadvantaged backgrounds, and Emma insisted on interviewing each candidate personally. "I want to make sure they really love learning," she told Richard. "Intelligent children who can't use their brains become sad children." When the presentation ended and the investors left, eager to fund EMA's next project, Richard reflected on how much his life had changed, but he had rebuilt his father's company stronger than ever. But more importantly, he had learned that success meant nothing without family and purpose. Emma came bounding toward him, still wearing the little business suit Sarah had bought her for important meetings. "How did I do, Dad?" The word dad still made Richard's heart skip a beat every time she said it. "You were perfect, sweetheart. Your grandfather would have been so proud of you." Emma's expression turned thoughtful. "Do you think he would have liked me?" Richard knelt down to her height, taking her little hands in his. "Emma, my father built this company because he believed that hard work and intelligence could overcome any obstacle. He would have adored you, not only because you are brilliant, but because you use your gifts to help other people. Like when I helped you get your company back. Like when you saved us both," Richard corrected gently. "You gave me back my company, but more importantly, you gave me a family. You gave me a purpose. You showed me that the most valuable things in life can't be measured in dollars." Emma hugged him tightly. "You saved me too, Dad. You believed I could help with adult problems and made me part of your family, even though I was just a homeless girl." Sarah joined them, surrounding Richard and Emma in a group hug. "You know what I think?" she said. "I think sometimes the best families aren't the ones you're born into, but the ones you choose. And sometimes the most important victories aren't the ones you plan, but the ones that happen when you're just trying to do the right thing." Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the boardroom, the city spread out below them. Millions of people pursuing their dreams, building their lives, facing their challenges. But up there, 47 stories above the street, where a desperate billionaire had met a brilliant homeless girl. A new kind of family had been born, formed by a shared purpose, mutual rescue, and the simple recognition that sometimes the most unlikely alliances can change everything. Emma broke away from the hug and looked seriously at her two parents. "Do you know what we should do now?" Richard and Sarah looked at each other, wondering what world-changing project their daughter would come up with this time. "What would it be, honey?" Richard asked. Emma smiled, her toothless grin lighting up the entire room. "We should help more people solve their big puzzles. There are a lot of people out there who need someone to see the patterns they can't see." Richard realized she was absolutely right. Emma had taught him that sometimes the greatest success doesn't come from accumulating wealth or power, but from using the gifts you have to lift others up. And with Emma's extraordinary mind, Sarah's legal experience, and his own business acumen, they could really help solve problems that others couldn't see. "The Hamilton family's problem-solving service?" Sarah suggested with a laugh. "I like it," Emma said seriously, "but we have to make sure we always help people who really need it, not just those who can pay the most." Richard looked at his bright, compassionate daughter. "I like it," Emma said seriously, "but we have to make sure that we always help people who really need it, not just those who can pay the most." Richard looked at his brilliant, compassionate, and wise daughter, who was beyond her years, and knew that his father's legacy was in the best possible hands. The company would continue to grow, the foundation would help countless gifted children, and the Hamilton name would be associated not only with business success, but with the radical idea that everyone deserves the opportunity to use their gifts to improve the world. "Deal," said Richard, extending his hand for a three-way handshake. "Partners forever. Partners forever," repeated Emma and Sarah in unison. And as the sun set over Manhattan, casting a golden glow through the windows of the boardroom where this extraordinary story had begun, a billionaire who had been homeless, a determined lawyer, and a 6-year-old genius girl looked toward a future full of infinite possibilities, the result of combining brilliance with compassion, success with purpose, and love with the courage to see patterns that others don't see.